afterwards. All right, good deal. All right, take a look now, if you will, at Philippians chapter 3. Philippians chapter 3. We've been in this series that we've just been walking through the book of Philippians, and what makes it such a powerful book is that it's kind of a one of a kind. It's a book that Paul wrote, a letter really, to the Christians at Philippi, and it was written to maturing believers, right? It was written to, that's what makes it different than most all of the others. It's not very much corrective. It's all encouraging, but it's more than just encouraging. It's press on, continue to grow, but grow stronger, and you're going to see it today. Today's title is Persevere. Persevere. You know, it is one of the great qualities and characteristics of what it means to be a believer, and usually to persevere is the thought here is that you have to have not only know the Lord, but you have to have known him for a while, because this persevere means to overcome. It means to stick with it, right? Immaturity always wants to quit, right? I'm gonna take my ball and go home. I mean, seriously, that's just immaturity. As we grow and as we mature, we learn to overcome, right? The greatest things that happen in your life, right, I've found, especially as a believer, but also in other areas, is that usually you have to work and overcome things to get to a goal. That just is the way it works, right? And those who persevere have been doing it long enough to where they know, okay, this is tough, this is hard, everything inside of me says just quit, right? But especially as believers, I am absolutely shocked at sometimes at the immaturity level among believers to where it's just so easily that they get offended and they quit. I mean, sometimes just over ridiculous things. And that's what Paul's talking about here. He's talking about persevering, right? Now, the only thing I need to talk to you about last week is in chapter 3, verse 10. This is the pivotal verse of really pretty much the whole book. It's kind of the goal that we have as believers. If you break it all down to just one goal, this is the goal, right? And he refers to this in the rest of this passage. Now, this is a powerful passage. Not because I'm sharing it with you, but my goal today is just to let it speak, right? This is not a passage. If you're not sure, even if you are a believer today, and not sure even what that means, then you'll understand a little bit that goes around it. But this really is a passage that spurs on, and not even the immature believer, but spurs on the mature believer to be stronger. That is what it says. So here's the passage, right? Here's the theme, if you will, the foundation. It's this: that I may know him, verse 10, right? That little phrase, that I may know him, is the determination of who you are in him. Because in anything, in any relationship, knowing someone is the foundational thing. You can't really ever love someone unless you know them. And the more you know them, the ability for you to be able to love them goes up. But if you don't know them, the love that you can have is limited. That's why in any relationship, you have to have time, experience, you have to overcome, persevere. In any relationship, it's the way that it is. But in this one, Paul says that my overarching desire, drive, goal is to know him. Right? And it says to know him in the power of his resurrection. That is the difference that who Christ is, right? What he came to do was die, cross, and resurrection, right? We'll talk about that at Easter, obviously. And the difference that has made in my life. So to me to understand it, to know him is the goal. Now, the weird part about this is that when you look at this passage, you begin to think and ask yourself the question, well, Paul, if anybody should know him, you should know him. I mean, you're the guy, right? You're the one. And yet Paul is real transparent here, very basic, but also it's powerful statement, right? Is that he understands, all right, that I may know him. That's foundation. And you're going to see everything else that falls back to this one little verse. Power of resurrection, all right? Sharing his sufferings, become like him, all right, in his death, all right? That by any means possible may attain. Now, obviously, to strive forward, to run, the resurrection, Christ, obviously that is what he came to do. And the difference it makes in our lives is it gives us an answer to death. But we'll talk about that in weeks to come. So, but the main phrase I want you to think on is that I may know him. Now, let's get to what we want to talk about today. All right. Now, number one, first thing I want to tell you today, all right, is to remember our call. Now, I'm talking to people who are his. If you're not sure about that, then we'll share with you what that means at the very end. But today in understanding the passage, because that's my passion, is just for you to understand, all right, is to remember our call. And Paul, in verse 12, he makes it plain, all right, straightforward. Listen to what he says. Not that I have already obtained this or that I'm already perfect. What Paul is trying to tell them is that first of all right, the goal is to know him. And second of all, I haven't arrived, right? I haven't arrived. And if anybody, it seems, who have known Christ, it have been Paul. And yet Paul is saying here, it's a journey. And in this particular illustration that he uses in the next few verses, it's a sports illustration, right? Paul loved to use sports illustrations, but the main illustration he loved to use was running, right? Running the race that is set before us, right? Keeping our eyes fixed, right? And all the different things. And you'll see it all come up in this passage, all right? What's the finish line? Or what's the goal? What's the purpose? To know him. The finish line is obviously, we'll talk about at the very, very end today. But it's this race. And everyone runs a race, right? If you look at it in this thought of, life is a race, right? You hear people, so it's a marathon, it's not a sprint. And you hear all the different things that people say. But when it comes down to it, there's this thought of what does it mean to the believer? And not just to those who are his, but to those who are maturing. So many times there's very little maturity among believers because of the culture you live in fights totally against the culture of being a believer and being a believer that's mature. You'll see it all. He shares every bit of it here, all right? But first thing you need to hear is Paul saying, hey, listen, I haven't arrived. It's real important for Paul to tell these Philippians is that don't think that there's this state of perfection you arrive at, or that you've arrived to the point to where you can just kind of sit down and tell everybody else, just be like me or whatever, all right? Paul still struggles, right? Paul still has to stay focused. Paul still battles the sin that lives in him, as he talked about in Romans. He is still saying, guys, I'm still in this. So don't look at me as someone who has it all together and that though has no problems. He says, you're not that I've already obtained all this, all right? He says, or that I've already been made perfect, he said. But it says here, I press on, right? To make it my own. That is to become more like him. Why? Because Christ has already taken hold of me. In other words, I'm his. And I'm working real hard, all right? I mean, obviously, I'm working real hard at making sure that it's all his, right? Why? Because there's still battles going on. Again, just read Romans, it tells you all about it, right? But brothers, This is a powerful thought. But brothers, I do not consider that I have made it my own. In other words, I'm not done yet. God's still working in me and through me. You know, so many times, I don't know, we have this thought of, we live in a culture of professionals and experts and whatever. And I've found that anybody that thinks they've arrived are not somebody you want to go to. Anybody know what I'm talking about? If they get real enamored with their expertness, y'all know what I'm saying? I found the best ones, whether they be in medical field, whether they be finance field, whether they be whatever, are the ones that keep learning, that keep moving, that keep growing. The ones who want to sit in a room and want you to look at them as being the expert, steer clear of them. Why? Because nobody ever arrives. And it's especially that way being a believer. If you're his, it's a constant motion of knowing him, right? And learning and doing it better, growing maturity-wise, right? He says, brothers, I have not made it yet, all right? I haven't arrived. He says, but there's one thing I do. Focus, right? Focus. I have found when a person matures, they have the ability to focus, right? Is that immaturity causes you to lose focus, right? And look at a whole bunch of things. But maturity teaches you to stay focused even when all the distractions are going around you, right? When I was a parent, right? Four children. None of them live here anymore, right? And Martha and I are still partying over that fact, all right? All right, so, but I had these children, especially one of them, she's a little more like me. Now, I've told y'all, you know, attention issues. And she was a little more like me. And so have you ever, if you're a parent today, have you ever told your child something and then you just knew, okay, they didn't hear anything, right? Because they were either, you know, they were watching television or there was something that caught and it just didn't happen. So I had a parenting technique, right? And it was to grab their face, right? And to do this, right? If you have horses, it's called blinders, right? Therefore, to get attention, right? To get focus, right? And bless her heart, because I just knew she wasn't hearing me, but it would always look more like this, right? When I would squeeze it, and I would say, no. Now, you know, did you hear me? You know, y'all know what I'm talking about. So therefore, the thought is, the more immature, all right, the less ability to be able to focus. The more mature, the more ability to focus, which is where he's going here, right? He's telling them that in this race, by the way, which he's getting better at running, right? Because he's working at it. He said, there's one thing I do, right? One thing, I just love that. Therefore, the ultimate focus is one thing, right? This one thing I do, right? And he gives you a couple of things that he doesn't do, right? But in verse 14, he tells you the one thing he does. But let's take a look at the others first, all right? He says, all right, this one thing I do. He says, first of all, I forget what lies behind me. Now, that's an interesting thing. In other words, that which is behind, okay, I put it aside. I lay it to rest. Now, the past is an amazing thing. So many times, and this may get a little quiet in the room because it's contemplative, because all of us are here. But whatever the past is, it's amazing how much damage the past can do on the future. So what's Paul talking about here? He's not talking about so much things that trip you up, but things that slow you down. Therefore, being tied to your past, right? Whatever that past is, slows you, right? Because I found as a believer, the longer I run this race, the longer I'm his, the more I learn, okay, that you can run faster without 5-pound weights on each ankle, right? But what does it mean to cut loose the past, right? Forget it. Well, it's not easily done. That's why he's talking to the mature here. He's not talking to those who are just starting, right? I don't know why we feel like we have to drag all this stuff around and words you can say, well, you just need to cut that loose. But yeah, but how do you do that? Well, it's learning. It's maturing, right? It's knowing him that I may know him. I mean, in a room this size, we have baggage, guys, all of us. Paul had baggage. I really believe, I've read Paul's writings for so many years, I believe Paul struggled with his past, big time. I think it was like an anchor, especially when he was such a religious zealot that he approved of murder in the name of who God is. Remember Stephen? He had people in prison. He had families torn apart. And see, Paul knew who he was not being a believer. But I'm sure those things followed him for a while. Guys, you just don't say, okay, I'm gonna forget it, no problem. No, those things follow you down the road, right? Bad decisions when you were young, especially. And you say, Jeff, I still am young. Well, be careful of your decisions now because they follow you the rest of your life, right? So then how do you cut those loose? How do you cut those loose? You learn, right? You learn. But you also learn by knowing him. Okay, don't miss this. Oh my goodness. If you have ears to hear this, right? That I may know him. The more I know about him, the more I know what he did on my behalf. The more I understand forgiveness. The more I understand that he did what he did so that I could be free of all of those things. And so for me to keep carrying them along is not accepting the freedom he's already given to me. Right? It's real easy to talk about, but it's hard to live. But once you live it, that's why Galatians says it was for freedom that Christ set us free. So if you're walking around in bondage and you are truly his, then remember you are, okay, willfully walking around with it. And you have to learn to cut it loose. Right? I will not let these things. Why am I trying to pay for something that Christ has already paid for himself? It's an amazing freedom whenever you get there. And I'm telling you, I think you get it a few drops at a time. I would love to say that you become a believer and then you just cut it all loose and there's never another issue. I don't know why it is the way that it is, but he's talking to mature believers to continue to encourage them, cut it loose. Cut it loose. Don't let what was back there mess up what goes on this direction. It's just as clear as it can be. Now, when we talk about our past, what I'm talking about there are past failures, past mess ups, past mistakes, past sins, past whatever. But you know what's harder to overcome than past failures? Are past successes. You're supposed to cut those loose too, right? In other words, if you've had some success in some areas, then cut it loose, right? Just cut it loose and keep moving. Because it seems that past successes, especially if you've counted them as your own successes, will keep you from being who he's called you to be. I don't know, it's amazing. You know, someone who always talks about the past success rarely ever does anything in the future. Does that make sense? But if you cut it loose and keep moving forward, it's who he's called us to be. Now, I'm not saying that those are things that are necessarily like bad for your running, but they're definitely slow you down. You see, we're talking to maturing believers. And so, guys, what's going to happen? He says, if you look backwards, you're going to see how much further ahead you are than everybody else. And what's the natural tendency? Slow down. Maybe even, hey, man, it's like the tortoise and the hare, right? Yeah, hey, I'm further ahead than 95% of the rest of the believers, right? And all of a sudden, you fall backwards. So you hear what he's saying here. Don't ever stop getting better. Don't ever stop running. Don't ever stop knowing him. Don't ever stop cutting stuff loose so that you can run faster, right? In other words, just unweight yourself, right? Because the goal is to know him. And the more you know him, the better you'll run. It's an incredible thing. And then the more you know him, the more you'll realize if you do have successes in your life, it'll be because he's worked through you for them. I get that. Guys, I've told you before, I told you a couple of weeks ago, I've got this great snapshot of remembrance of who I was before I was his. And so then whatever may have happened in between that, I know it's him working through me. So how in the world can I take credit for successes when in reality, it's God who works in you, right? That's 3 weeks ago. So you have then this picture, right? There's one thing I do, right? I forget what's behind. And it says here, I strain toward what lies ahead. In other words, my focus is on knowing him, right? Knowing being present tense and future tense, not past tense. So what I already know is behind me, but what's ahead of me, right, is what the focus is. So I press on toward the goal. These are all running terms. I press on toward the goal for the prize of the upward call of God in Christ Jesus. In other words, the upward call. That's why I called this, remembered your call. Remember who he's called, if you're his, right? Guys, this is different stuff than Corinthians. I mean, Corinthians is for the immature believer. I mean, Paul is not saying here, like he said to the Corinthians, okay, guys, you got to stop getting drunk at the Lord's Supper, at communion. Right? That's Corinthians. That's what he had to tell them. They wouldn't even get any of this. Right? Why? Because they're all so self-absorbed and absorbed in themselves. They were barely even crawling, much less running, right? So it was a constant talk to the immature, and especially in the book of 1 Corinthians. But Philippians is not like that. It's to spur on those of you that are his to not only keep moving, but grow stronger as you do, right? Lighten things up so you can run faster, that kind of thing, right? Right? Go from good to best in your choices, right? It's just a lot of fun to read, right, when you take a look at it. Look at verse 15. Just so you know, right, I'm not making this up, right? Let those of us who are mature think this way. So if you've been following him for a while, you got some mileage on the road, right? You understand what I'm talking about, then you need to keep in your mind focus. Focus. Focus, 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 focus. It's amazing. When you really catch on, look at what he's saying. He goes on to say in verse 16, only let us hold true to what we've already attained. In other words, guys, let's not give up ground here. You see what he's saying to them? Hey, listen, let's not, let's not say, oh no, look how well we're doing, and let's just rest on that. Let's continue moving. Let us hold true to where we are, right? Let's not go backwards. It's pretty cool. It's pretty cool stuff when you look at it, right? Brothers, join in imitating me, all right? And keep your eyes on those who walk according to the example you have in us. In other words, everybody needs a coach. Everybody needs a trainer. Everybody needs someone who can take them from where they're doing good and to go better. In other words, Paul is saying, hey, listen, I'm a follower. He's already said I haven't gotten there yet, okay? But I'm ahead of you. So I can help you, right? So if you want to follow, then follow. But as long as, that's an amazing thing to say, right? All right, good. Number one is remembering our call. Number two is remembering the pitfalls. Now this is, again, something for us to think on. This is going to be one of those moments, where you're listening or reading the scriptures and your mouth drops open as you're thinking, right? And you don't know your mouth is open. Does that make sense? And it's one of those passages you're like, boy, that is it. All right, here we go. So remembering pitfalls. Now, the other things we've talked about are weights. They just slow you down. These are pitfalls. These are things that cause you to trip, right? And if you learn them, you can grow from them. But I don't know why it is that some of these pitfalls are real attractive to us, all right? Let's take a look at it, all right? All right, for many of whom I have often told you, and now tell you even with tears, walk as enemies of the cross of Christ. A lot of times, I've read, we're talking about believers who have gotten off track. I don't seem to think so, but it could be, right? Because the word walk means to live, or the way you live. And their living is those who are enemies, right? Enemies of the cross. But that doesn't mean that they're not one of them, because he wouldn't be talking about all those who weren't part of them. It means they were part of them, but their desires and drives are not those who should be his. Now, don't miss this. No. Verse 19. Their end is destruction, right? So that whatever journey they're on, it ends in destruction. And he describes them, these pitfalls. It says their God is their belly. Okay? Oh, what does that mean? All right, here we go. Their God is their belly. That's actually a pretty good translation. The actual word there means your abdomen, right? But a lot of your translations, if you have different translations, and it's a pretty good translation, but it's kind of reading what it is as opposed to the actual word, and it's the appetite, right? So then, their God is their appetite. Okay, what does that mean? Well, we got lots of appetites, right? Lots of appetites. Most of them God-given, right? Different appetites, desires that are implanted into you. The desire to be loved, right? The obvious one, the one that's mentioned here is food, hunger, right? But Jesus used that, hunger and thirst after righteousness. But the question is, what do you hunger and thirst for? So we're not talking about being in the race as much as what is it that you're turning to come through, right? What is it that you're counting on? So is this a believer who's just gotten so far off track? Maybe. Is this just someone who may think they're a believer, but not probably? But this is, again, it shows itself pretty quickly. The God is in the appetites. That is the things you desire. And we all have different ones, different appetites. What are some different kind of appetites? Oh my goodness, it's the appetite of wanting to be thought well of by others, to be admired by others, down to the desire for stuff and things I want, down to the pretty much everything that goes in that people seek. Obviously, one of the great appetites in our culture, which it takes over, is the sexual appetite. You see, the thing about appetites, though, right, is that they're never fulfilled, right? And if you put too much stress on that appetite, what happens is you'll consume more, and then the appetite grows. And pretty soon, the appetite can't be filled. Their end is destruction. Does that make sense? And we live in a world where people are consumed by their appetites. I mean, people who have everything are sometimes the ones that are least satisfied with what they have. Why is that? Because their appetite has grown to consume them. Oh, the sexual appetite, come on, guys. That has consumed a whole generation. And it's really sad to watch. I mean, they joke, well, I want to be sad. Okay, well, knock yourself out. But intimacy becomes impossible for you because you've consumed yourself in an appetite that can't be fulfilled. Amazing, isn't it? So what he's saying here is God's their appetite. It's not just the sexual thing, but that's a big one in our culture. It's all the other, from any pursuit that you're counting on to come through to fulfill you, right? And usually the pursuits, whatever race you jump into, it ends with disappointment. And we've talked about that often, right? So their appetites rule them. So it's usually pretty easy to tell, right? If somebody's a believer, or at least someone who's growing in their faith, is because their appetites begin to have less and less control over them, right? Because as a believer, right, what's your goal as a believer? Don't answer it out loud, just listen, right? What is your goal as a believer, right? To know him. This one thing I do, right? I chop, not may of what have happened in my past in the appetites, but this one thing I do, right? That I may know him. And then the more that you know him, the more that you can fill empty places. That's what Paul's talking about there. And so as maturity tells you, I need to stop turning to these empty wells that don't have any water. Does that make sense? But yeah, they promise to have water. I know what they promise. But how many times do we have to keep going to them before we find out they don't have them? Experience is one that messes up quite a bit, but eventually it goes through your thick head, okay, this doesn't get it, right? Sometimes, sadly to say, it's all people think they have. So they keep going for the quick fix and the appetite continues to grow until it gets out of control, right? And sometimes out of control over things that you and I or our culture might call positive, but it still never really makes it. This is what he's talking about, running the race, okay? The end is destruction, right? Their God, that is, they're servant to their own appetites, right? They glory in their shame, all right? What do you brag about, right? What do you brag about? Tells a whole lot about you, right? Back to the sexual thing. People that brag about that, the whole sexual conquest thing and all the things, remember this, all right? What they glory in is actually their shame, right? So what they are bragging about, in reality, they're only hurting themselves. But not just that area. There's a whole wide, you all know what I'm talking about. I could give you 1,000 illustrations and it comes in 1,000 different packages. But it's this whole thing. The end leads in destruction, therefore it becomes an appetite you can't fulfill. The God is the appetite, right? The glory, what you're glorying in reality is the shame of it all. And it's a mind that is set on finding what I'm looking for in temporary things here on this earth. You see, you were created with eternity in your heart. You were created in God's image. Therefore, temporary things will never fill the deepest need you have in here. That's why those that run that race end in disappointment. So it's a powerful thing to understand avoiding the pitfalls. Because as an immature believer, you're still prone to the pitfalls. But the more you've run this race, the less those have control over you. It's amazing how it works. Let me give you an illustration, right? I have family land, right, in Tennessee, and I go up a couple times a year to take care of things. And one time a year, I go up to bush hog. If you don't know what that is, it's like a big lawnmower, right? And there's like, I don't know, 80 acres or something that I only cut it once a year because I don't have time to do it anymore. But I ride, right? I've got this big tractor. It's old, but it's awesome. All right, don't mess with my tractor, all right? And so it's in the 80s, it's in the old 80s, but it's huge, right? I got this 15-foot mower, bush hogger, right? And I cut things down, right? Takes at least a couple of days, sometimes 3, depending on the weather. And so, but first year, I was cutting everything, and we have some low areas where there's a stream that runs by. Well, previously that year, there had been huge rains, so everything had flooded. And you remember that when everything floods, is that it runs back into the creek. It's about 4 feet, right? And it left a ditch, right? Well, if you only cut once a year, then the weeds are about 10 feet tall, right? Seriously. I mean, sometimes you're cutting and you all you have is a bank of weeds around you, right? And so I'm cutting down by the tree line. Next to, right over that is the creek. And I'm going along, everything's great, man. I'm mowing this stuff down. And all of a sudden, the front, it takes me by surprise, but the front end of my tractor hits this ditch. And down it goes. But this is one of those bigger tractors. I bought it really used and really old, but it's huge. It's a little dangerous, to be honest with you, because it won't stall out, right? It's going to keep going no matter what. So it has the power to push the front wheels out of the ditch, and then the back ones drop in. Now that's when it gets bad, because you're almost kind of shocked. You know, wham, wham, and then wham, and then it's got so much power it begins lifting up the front of the tractor. And by the time I do get to the clutch, right? Don't need the brake, that doesn't matter. I get to the clutch and it drops back down, right? And so I am trying not to fall off, right? And so I'm going somewhere with this, by the way. Anyway, so I called these people to come get me, right? I have to walk, because there's no cell reception. I have to walk out to the nearest highway, and I find somebody, because no, I don't have anything big enough for that. I don't have anything big enough for that. I find a guy who brings almost like this earth mover, this huge piece of machinery. I'm like, oh Lord, what's this going to cost? And he comes down there, right, and ties off this big chain, and he pulls me out of the ditch. And so, thank you, several $100s later, and so thank you, and so I finish up. Now, the next year, I thought I remembered where the ditch was. All right? And and you know what happened? Although when I hit it the first time, all right, I didn't freak out. I was actually kind of mad at myself, like, oh, I did it again. And so it went down, came back up, the back end went in again, but I was able to, before the front end came up. And so again, couldn't get out because it's a ditch. And so I walk this is a year later, right? And I go and I call, same guy comes out, right? And he says, wasn't I here a year ago? I said, yeah, I think so. And so I paid him again, right? You know the story, okay. Listen, you are not destined to keep falling in the same pitfalls all the time. You can learn, because I have not dropped into it again. Right? Does that make sense? I know exactly where it is. And the last 7 years or so, no problems. You see, life as a believer is learning and growing. Stop shooting people for dropping in the pitfall, and stop shooting them for dropping in it a second time, right? We've all got our own issues. We all have our same journey. We all are working hard if we're His. So encouragement is needed more than that, because that's what Paul's doing here. Hey guys, keep moving, keep moving, keep moving. You're getting it, you're getting it, you're getting it. Because it is kind of a thrill. All right? It is kind of a thrill, right? When you've walked with Him long enough to where you have some strength over the pitfalls that used to get you every time. Does that make sense? If you're not there yet, guys, keep moving. Keep learning, right? You're gonna fail, right? but you're going to be stronger. You're going to learn as you do, right? So as I close with this thought, right? Number 3 is remembering who we are, right? Remembering who we are. This is something to remember in this race, right? Is to remember who you are. Look at verse 20. But our citizenship, that word is, this is the only time it's used in the New Testament. There's a verb form of it somewhere else, but this is the only time this word is used, right? But our citizenship is in heaven, and from it we await a Savior who's Christ, right? All right, so that's our destination. That's our actual home. And it was a word Paul knew that these Philippians would understand. Why? Because they were in Philippi, but if you remember, I told you the story the first week we did Philippians, is that they were a Roman colony. If you remember, the Battle of Philippi was this huge battle that they won, and that Caesar Augustus, right, he gave them this city, and he honored them, right, as a present, if you will, as a gift for winning the war, that they would be a Roman colony, which meant that they would have the same rights as everyone who was in Rome, even though they weren't in Rome. You hear what he's saying to them. Remember, guys, you may be living here, but this world's not your home, is basically what he's saying. Therefore, you and I are going to be running different races than what most everybody else runs. It's going to look different, right? We're different, is basically what he says. And he goes on to talk about, which I don't have as much time to share with you, who will transform our lowly body to be like his glorious body. So, see, in this world, all we know is decay, right? We get older, right? Born young, right? And you get older, right? And decay. Everything does. Whether you buy a new car, whether it's whatever, it's this subject to decay. So there's coming a time when that won't be here. That's what he's talking about with this glorious body, by the power that enables us, that enables him to have everything subject to himself. Now, with this thought, now you understand what he's talking about, right? This drive, this growth, this learning, right? You know, that I may know him, that I may know him. And the more I get to know him, right, the more I learn, the more I grow, the more things that don't have the hold over me, and the more I'll be like him, right? Now, I've heard people say to me, things like, well, I don't have to, I've been going for years. I don't think it's that big a deal. I can stay home, watch at home, or I don't need to be in a connection group because I'm fine, or I'll just, but here's the question, guys. Being in a small group here, right? Do you go because it's what you need, or do you go because there's a potential you might meet someone else's need? It shows where you are in the maturity department. If it's still all about you, right, then there's some more growing to do. But what he's talking about here, move on past yourself, right? Move on past yourself and start making a difference in other people's lives. Why? Because that's what Christ did. And if your ultimate drive and race is to know him, then this is what you're going to want to do. That's what it means to grow. And one of the telltale signs of someone who's really growing or has walked with the Lord for a while is they'll get less and less self-centered. It just is the way it works. So chapter 4, verse 1 says, therefore, my brothers, listen to the affection Paul has. Therefore, my brothers, whom I love and I long for, my joy and my crown, stand firm in the Lord. Right? You can only say that to those who understand what it's talking about, right? Stand firm. There's never been a time you've become his. It's not about being a part of a denomination or anything. There'll be some folks up here afterwards who love to talk with you. But if you are his today, remember, right, that I may know him. All right, let me pray with us. Lord, thank you for this time. Thank you for your love for us. God, thank you for what we've seen today, what we've learned today. And God, let us move on towards what it says here, maturity. And God, if there's anyone here today that needs to know you for the first time, God, I pray they probably won't leave until they know what that means. But God, Lord, we realize it's all about you. Continue us in that journey. And God, we will give you the glory for it. And Lord, we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. All right.